Welcome. Welcome to COVID Policies, a campus discussion. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Matthew Garrett, and I'm the faculty lead for the Renegade Institute for Liberty. Our campus organization is committed to fostering open conversations of complicated issues. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our amazing support team here at BC who manage the logistics of these sorts of events, especially Leah and Kristen. They're wonderful. Thank you. I'd also like to take just a moment to plug our next webinar on Thursday, February 3rd, when Dr. Mary Grabar will be discussing her recent book on the 1619 Project. I hope you'll join us for that as well. But tonight, our focus is on COVID policies. For the last 2 years, the world has scrambled to manage the threat of COVID-19. National, state, and local agencies have turned to a variety of strategies. National debates over mandates and school shutdowns have also manifested locally in Kern County school board meetings. Here at Bakersfield College, the administration has employed shutdowns, mandatory masking, mandatory vaccinations, location tracking, and daily health checks enforced by hired security. To what extent are these and other policies well thought out? Do they go too far, or perhaps not far enough? How is COVID-19? What science is contested, and what do we all agree upon? Do we have an ethical obligation to follow the protocols or freedom? How do we balance conflicting calls for safety and liberty? Tonight's panel may address some of these and other issues. Our guests were each invited to share their own thoughts for a few minutes, and then hopefully we can engage each other and viewers by discussing questions that you all submit in the Q&A box. I would add that tonight's guests were not selected to rebut Bakersfield College administration policies, but rather to provide a rich spectrum of thought about national, local, and maybe Bakersfield College policies, a discussion that our campus administration has worked to suppress and control by blocking emails and discouraging potential panelists. This behavior is troubling for an institution of higher education, but I'm optimistic that our panelists tonight will indeed exhibit healthy, reasoned, friendly conversation from a variety of viewpoints. There may be disagreements, but I expect there will also be common ground and friendly gestures among fellow travelers seeking for greater understanding. I ask that any questions you submit also have a respectful tone. The purpose of the event tonight is not to foster debate or conflict, but to have an honest, intimate chat about COVID-19 related policies. Our first speaker will be Alicia Loken, who is a professor and the department chair of nursing. And she's also spoken to our KCCD board on the very issue of COVID policy. She'll be followed by Professor Jimena de Silva, who's a biochemist with experience in mRNA research. Then hopefully we'll hear from Patrick O'Neill, professor of anthropology, who boldly pressed for a campus conversation on our faculty listserv. And then finally, Justin Flint, professor of automotive sciences, who also has spoken to the KCCD board regarding COVID policy. So without further ado, let me welcome Professor Alicia Loken.
Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. First, I just want to say thank you to the Institute of Liberty for facilitating this conversation. It's, I think, so nice to have a forum where we can have a collegial discussion about topics that get so kind of hotly debated in our media these days. So it's nice to have a conversation that hopefully doesn't devolve into the kind of stuff we see out there in the public sector. So Matt mentioned that I'm a professor of nursing. I've been a registered nurse for 21 years. My background is mostly critical care and emergency room nursing. And then I've been teaching at Bakersfield College in the nursing and the RN and the vocational nursing programs for the last 15 years or so. So I have a lot of clinical experience and then also experience with the students. I guess as a nursing professor, I kind of come to you guys from the position of wanting to provide some factual information and data and some kind of background on on COVID-19 virus, kind of more than I'm interested really in debating the policy side of that, although I'm sure we'll get into that later. So I'm just going to start with some kind of comments to provide some clarity and maybe some information that people aren't aware of related to the coronavirus as we're seeing it now. And then I hope afterwards I can answer any questions that people have about the research that's out there to the best of my ability. Obviously, I haven't read everything, and there's new research every single day on the coronavirus itself and on the health concerns related to it and treatment of it and that kind of thing. So to start, the coronaviruses are a large family of viruses that are common in many different species of animals, but they very rarely jump to people. And that's kind of what's most, I think, frightening about our experience with the coronavirus in the last couple of years is that we don't have a lot of previous exposure to coronaviruses. So we don't have a whole lot of natural immunity to it as compared to like other viruses that we see regularly, like adenoviruses or influenza, that kind of thing that we see regularly, different variants of it. Humans have not had a lot of experience with coronaviruses. In fact, the only real experience we've had with coronaviruses in the past were the MERS and the SARS coronaviruses that were in the Middle East and in Saudi Arabia in the last 10 years. And that occurred when those viruses actually jumped from animal populations to human populations and then began mutating in human populations, but they were able to isolate those to kind of smaller areas, whereas COVID-19 is a coronavirus that obviously was able to spread out of the area that it originated, which we think is Wuhan, China, and then spread to, all over the world and became a pandemic. Since the initial outbreak of COVID-19, we've seen the emergence of a number of variants of the virus, and this is completely normal. Like viruses routinely undergo changes. And formation of variants is not really surprising. I don't think that was anything that anyone didn't expect, particularly because COVID-19 is so widespread in the population of all humans in the world, essentially. There's a lot of ability for mutation to occur. So right now, the most dominant variant in the United States is the Omicron variant. Some people are still getting Delta, but right now about 99.5% of all new infections in the US right now are the Omicron variant. And we'll probably see more variants as time goes by. We'll see variants coming from other places in the world and spreading similarly. Why is COVID-19 so concerning? One, like I said, is that we haven't had a lot of exposure and natural immunity to them in the past. And then the other is the symptoms that it causes in the human population. So just speaking to that, I was at Heart Hospital today taking care of patients. They have about a 24-bed unit that they have open. They have a large area that's closed because they don't have adequate staff to manage it right now because they have people out sick and that kind of thing with the coronavirus. And they can't afford to pay the travelers, but they've got, a fairly large unit, and maybe a quarter of that unit are COVID patients today when I was in there, just roughly when I was there, that are in isolation. Some are vented, some are not vented. That are pretty sick. But the problem with COVID-19 is that it causes kind of a widespread inflammatory response in the body. It kind of overstimulates, and I'm simplifying this, but it overstimulates the immune system. And the inflammation causes damage to the blood vessels, to the different organs in the body. And this can lead to respiratory failure, and the need for mechanical ventilation. And I think that's kind of what most people are familiar with, is that they end up with like a COVID pneumonia or acute respiratory distress syndrome. But it also causes failure of other organs like our kidneys, our pancreas, and it's able to infect the brain. And we're seeing a lot of research recently about neurologic changes, kind of lasting neurologic changes that are very similar to what we're seeing in Alzheimer's patients, in patients that previously were infected with COVID-19. And some of the people that are displaying these symptoms were not seriously ill. These aren't people that required hospitalization. Even people with minimal symptoms that included any kind of neurologic symptoms like loss of taste and smell and headache, that kind of thing, are they're finding that they have kind of long lasting, they call it a COVID fog, but they're doing research on that where they're looking at cerebral spinal fluid in these people and seeing that there's increased antibody activity in there. They have proteins that they're not supposed to have in the cerebral spinal fluid. And that kind of has long lasting consequences. So right now, the fatality rate, and I know this is kind of one of those things that's widely, argued. The fatality rate from COVID is about 1.4%. Worldwide, the World Health Organization estimates is about 3.4%. So about 1.4% of the people that get COVID-19 will die from it in the US right now, and about 3.4% worldwide, which, I mean, you never minimize any death is a sad thing for the people that are close to them. But if you look at the US population of, roughly 300 million people, that means about 420,000 people will die of it the first time they get it. Okay. The problem is that we can get COVID-19 more than once, particularly with the emergence of variants. And we know that when people contract COVID-19, while they do develop some natural immunity to it, some of that immunity is very short-lived. Like the antibody response, they're thinking 90 days to 6 months is kind of the typical amount of time that you have immunity to it. A couple of recent studies have kind of developed models to project infection with COVID-19. And the current models project that an unvaccinated person will get COVID-19 approximately every 3 to 16 months. So that means every time someone is exposed and contracts COVID-19 and you catch it multiple times. And then certainly with variants, that could increase the risk of catching it because you may have one variant and then get another variant. Every time that they get it, there's a 1.4% percent chance of dying. Okay, so every time you contract it, you still have that same risk. That's the estimates right now. And then I think the thing that I worry about as a nurse is that although we talk about the death rates, and I see lots of bumper stickers that say, it kills less than 1% of people that get it and all that. One, they don't take into account that you can catch it multiple times and that every time your risk is that. But I think what we're failing to recognize is that's mortality is the death rate, but I think we're failing to recognize the morbidity that is going to be associated with COVID. There are numerous kind of longer term studies now that we've had exposure to this virus for longer periods of time that are looking at long-term complications. And we're seeing things like significant increases in the number of children who are presenting with type 1 diabetes following infection with COVID-19, even children who were not seriously ill. So they were mildly symptomatic, minimally symptomatic, and yet they have 2 to 3 times the risk of developing type 1 diabetes afterwards. We're seeing increased risk of, obviously, if people have had respiratory complications and survive COVID, they have long-term problems like pulmonary fibrosis. We're seeing risks of we're seeing myocarditis in these people. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of Alzheimer's or dementia syndromes that we're seeing in the brain. So what really worries me is that even though someone may survive it and say, well, I have a 99% chance of surviving it, there is still pretty significant risk of having long-term complications potentially, and we don't know what those complications are yet. The last thing I kind of want to mention that is problematic about COVID is the impact on our healthcare systems. Is that, yes, okay, the fatality rate may be 1%, but there's a lot more people than that are requiring hospitalization and care in order to recover from this virus. And offering care to large numbers of people that would not normally be hospitalized or required healthcare is significantly impacting our healthcare systems in that they're overwhelmed taking care of that group of patients. And then there's no longer beds and procedures and OR time and staff to care for people that have kind of our everyday health problems, our cancers, our heart disease, our follow-up, our preventative care for, different cancers, that kind of thing. So what can we do to protect ourselves and our communities? The first thing we can do is wear a mask. And the CDC is now recommending that we wear properly fitted N95 masks, but I just want to clarify that because I know the CDC gets a lot of flack about changing their stance on things. And, you know, I'm not naive to the fact that I'm sure there's some political pressure exerted against the CDC as well, but they do change in relation to the data that we're getting from lots of the organizations that are doing studies. And I want to point out that it's not just government organizations that are studying COVID. It's also being studied by pharmaceutical companies. It's being studied by private industry. It's being studied at the university level, that kind of thing. But what I want to mention about the masks is that even a cloth mask still helps protect other people from us. So if I were to develop COVID, wearing a cloth mask would still provide someone else some protection, but wearing a cloth mask, if I come in contact with someone who's infected and unmasked, doesn't prevent me from catching it. So the CDC's recommendation to wear the KN95s and the N95s is actually to prevent yourself from catching it from others, rather than kind of the previous focus was on if we all cooperated and we all wore any kind of barrier on our face, at least that would prevent us from infecting one another. So wearing masks is still one of the best protections that we have about spreading it to others. Wearing KN95s or the N95 masks is the best way that we can protect ourselves if we come in contact with people that are contagious. And that includes children. I want to mention, because I have had some conversations with people that think that children cannot become infected with it or that children don't spread it. All current data suggests that children contract COVID at the same rates as adults and are just as have the same potential to spread it as adults do. Initially, the rates were a little bit lower just because children were being sequestered at home. And now that they're back at school, we're seeing the same spread and same incidence in children. They are less likely to be severely symptomatic and get sick and end up in the hospital, but they do still contract COVID at the same rate and spread it. Okay, the next thing I would say is, of course, the vaccines, right? That's going to be our next line, our best line of protection. Against all the variants that we have seen so far. So the 3 vaccines in use in the US today are the Pfizer, Moderna vaccines and the Johnson & Johnson. J&J has been linked to some pretty significant blood clotting and bleeding disorders, so kind of not as recommended at this time as the mRNA vaccines, which are the Moderna and the Pfizer. Moderna and Pfizer initially were really successful at preventing infection as well as decreasing how sick people got. But with Omicron, we found that it's way less likely to prevent infection, but still provides great protection against hospitalization. So it only provides about a 20%. It's only about 20% effective now against preventing infection with Omicron, but it's still greater than 90% effective at preventing people from being hospitalized who contract it versus a non-vaccinated patient. And I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A if anyone has like factual questions about how the vaccines. And I do want to mention that getting vaccinated is not without risk, right? There is, of course, risk associated with getting the vaccines, but all the available data that's out there suggests that the risk of vaccination is much smaller than the risk associated with contracting COVID-19, particularly repeatedly over time. The significant vaccination risk rate, like the risk of having significant complications, is about 0.001% versus that 1% fatality rate with COVID, and then also the risk of having other problems. So just quick data, and then I'm almost done. So far, about 209 million people in the United States have received their primary series of vaccines. 82 million people are up to date on their vaccines, including boosters, and this was as of yesterday. That means about 63% of the population in the United States are fully vaccinated against the COVID-19 virus. What that tells me is that they're fairly safe and effective. Like, we have pretty good data with those kinds of numbers that that these are safe vaccines that are effective in reducing mortality, at least at this point, from it. So I want to just close with saying, as of yesterday, there were about 870,000 deaths from COVID in the United States that have been reported. And there's some question about those numbers, right? Everyone that has COVID, who dies with COVID, kind of gets into this count. But let's say even it's off by, 10%. Like we're still talking about 700,000 people who have died from COVID in the last year. And so I would just want to encourage everyone out there, please ask any questions you have, but I would highly encourage and recommend that if you're able to, that you get vaccinated, that you wear a mask, not only to protect yourself, but to care for the people in our community.
Thank you. Thank you. Jimena?
All right, my turn. So a couple of things that I do want to say is sort of my motivation for being here tonight. I think, as of course my baby chooses now to cry in the background, so if you'll excuse that, I'm home alone with her. As was pointed out, sorry, I lost my train of thought. My baby crying in the background. Okay, let me get her off that chair. If you'll all excuse me. Sorry, bad timing. All right, thank you all. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is that this issue has been so divisive that I really wanted to be here and just chat with people that have different opinions, even different scientific opinions than my own, and just do it in a educated, intellectual manner where we essentially at the end agree to disagree and still be friends. I think currently we lack those examples in our society, so I just wanted to give that one. So amongst us four panelists, I expect there's going to be many things that we're going to disagree on, and then at the end, it's like I've always learned something when I've chatted with somebody who holds a different viewpoint than mine. So that's essentially why I'm here tonight. Also, even amongst the scientific community, there are different opinions. Okay, so as Alicia mentioned, this is a novel virus. We're creating data as we go along. So even among scientists, there is dissent among how to interpret this data, even how this data is collected, and whether this data is good scientific data. Oh my God. So anyway, so one of the things that I wanted to point out, all right, I'm gonna have to do it again. I'm gonna close the door this time and see how that goes. So excuse me again. All right, take two. So I'll start by saying that I'm in favor of the Great Barrington Declaration. That might turn a lot of people off. If you've never heard of it, I recommend people look it up. It's by 3 doctors out of, I think it's Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard. And what they propose is a focused protection model. Okay, so instead of doing blankets, just protect the people that are at risk and let everybody else essentially live their lives. I'm going to chat about several things. I'll put some links on where I got the information on the chat. So my own stance is that I don't support either mask mandates or vaccination mandates. Mask mandates, there is research also showing that masks are ineffective. Actually, as I was reviewing for this, I was surprised to see some research on this, including for masking in surgeries. So I was not expecting to see that one. And I'll post that one on the chat for people to take a look at as they want. And one of the things that I didn't expect to see is, as I was reviewing these this morning, the language in the conclusions has changed. So like pre-2020, the conclusions tended to be more assertive, like masks are ineffective against protection of respiratory viruses, such as influenza, the flu, right? And then, and that's why when COVID started, the CDC said to the public, don't mask. This doesn't work, because they were basing it off that research that was their prior, and the conclusions were pretty, like, the language was just stronger. Post 2020, now the language started to get more doubtful, like we think it doesn't protect quite as well, but it might. Okay, so one of the things that I've seen and as a scientist I worry about is there's a suppression. I think, okay, this is my opinion. I think that certain ideas are being actively suppressed. Like, if you're a scientist and you want to do research that masking is ineffective, well, that grant right now is probably not going to get funded. If you're a scientist now and you're saying that, and that is going to bring you censure from most of the scientific community, how many people are willing to bet their careers on that? So I worry that the way that we're doing science is being biased towards a certain opinion and not the other. And that itself is anti-science. I keep going back to a quote that I saw that says, if you can question it, it's science. If not, it's propaganda. So I worry about when we defend the thesis, we're meant to defend our ideas, and any attack of those ideas is not a personal attack. Okay, so I worry about what I see in that. Another example, at risk of annoying a lot of people in the audience, I will mention the dreaded name ivermectin. So what has been done with ivermectin is blowing my mind. I mean, I can't, like, I have a hard time wrapping my brain around that this could happen in a first world country. Side note, I'm from Uruguay, which is a third world country. So I sometimes look at kind of like, okay, what happens in a first world country? I go like, no, I expected this from my own country, but I didn't expect this from the US. And one of those things is what I see portrayed in the general media about it, which is, it's a horse drug. I also happen, my husband is a horse trainer, so I'm quite familiar with it as a veterinary drug as well. But then they won't tell you that it won the Nobel Prize in 2015. It's on the safest. So it's on the list of 25 essential medicines by the WHO, and it's a pretty safe drug. But that, obviously, we're not saying that people have to go take it at horse dosages. Okay, no, there's a human prescription for it. So one of the other things that I kind of wanted to chat about, and I think I'm doing okay on time, is like I find it disturbing that early treatments are not being looked at. So the cynic in me. So I'll go a bit on a tangent. My actual research was with nicotine addiction, and one of the things that I know from looking at that literature is it took about 20 years. It took 20 years for the public to fully know the damaging effects that smoking cigarettes had. And the reason for that was purely monetary. The tobacco companies didn't want that knowledge to get out. Okay. Another example, leaded fuels. Leaded fuels, same story. Okay, so there are some of us, and this leads me to vaccine mandates. There are some of us who are vaccine hesitant. Like, I'll be honest in saying I didn't want to get vaccinated. I did it to keep my job, and the reason why I didn't want it, because I wanted to wait to see the safety data. Okay, this is new technology. We don't know what the long-term side effects are. So, when I signed that paper, it said, oh, I understand what the risks are, and out of my own free will, I'm undertaking this vaccine. I signed it anyway. I did it anyway. but it wasn't out of my own free will. It was do that or lose my job, or look for some exception that I didn't want to do because I felt it wasn't a religious exemption. So those of us who feel that way have now lost our ability to essentially reserve judgment. Okay, and I understand. So the argument would be, well, you need to do it to keep other people safe. I've heard that one before. Okay, but this vaccine does not prevent transmission. Even the CDC has admitted that. So then that argument I don't think is cogent anymore. Okay, it would be true for something like the polio vaccine or the measles vaccine. And I'll point out, I'm not anti-vaccine. I'm vaccinated against pretty much everything. But that, you know, yeah. So anyway, so on that note, you know, there's this huge push for a vaccine that we don't know the full safety profile of, that where there's also a huge monetary incentive tied to these vaccines. And in case you just to give some numbers here. So Pfizer quarterly sales before vaccines, $30 billion for all of their drugs combined. Okay, so every single drug that Pfizer owned, so quarterly sales pre-COVID, 30 billion. Okay, Pfizer quarterly sales in the last quarter from vaccines alone, $50 billion. So there's some people like me that see that and go, whoa, there's a huge monetary incentive. I can take that even further and go like, well, some of us even think that the push for boosters is essentially the subscription model being applied to health. So if you can convince people that they need this vaccine to be safe and that they need it every X number of months, you now have subscribers for life. So some of us are going, whoa, can we see more data? So the mandates is what I have a problem with. I do want to address a question that came up, a comment that came up in the chat, stating that immunity that people get from COVID, from COVID is not as strong as the people that are vaccinated and boosted. There is data actually and data coming out of the CDC to showing that that's not the case. So I do want to show that one while I'm at it. Hold on, I'm gonna open that one. And I will link this video as well on the chat for those of you who do want to see it. Okay, so there's that video that I'm going to show right now. These are CDC numbers there. That should make it easier for people to see. And what you're seeing are the estimated risk. The CDC took numbers out of California and New York. The blue line, that is people that were neither vaccinated nor had COVID. The solid blue line, like the not solid blue, but the dash blue line, that is people that were vaccinated but haven't had COVID. And then the other two lines are people that are either vaccinated or unvaccinated, but with COVID. So that have had COVID. So natural immunity is actually more protective than just being vaccinated. And note how the and these data are actually brand new. This data came out, I think January 24th, from the CDC. And this video has a link to that data too for those of you who want to see it. So what I see with this, what the vaccine mandates do is that now in failing to recognize natural immunity, now you're forcing people that are not vaccinated to take this vaccine. And now all they're having is risk. They have no benefit. It's all risk. And I disagree with that. then finally I'll do a specific thing about the policy, and then Matt, I promise because I'm off on time, aren't I? Yeah. So my thoughts on our own COVID policies. I'm often at a loss on what to put on that health checker app. Like when I look at those symptoms, it's, have you had any of the following in the last 10 days? Headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, body aches. Yes, very often. Is it COVID? I mean, for example, I horseback ride. When I overdo it, my whole body aches after. By the way, on a side note, whoever says that the horse does all the work when you're horse riding has never been on a horse. So it's left to the reader to sort of make a judgment call on, is this COVID related or not? So it's just, I don't know how those policies are meant to be applied. I don't understand that. Yeah, and then I mean I have more to say, but I'll shut up until it's my turn to answer questions. So those are one last thing. I worry about what these policies do to our society, like on a whole. Okay, so I've had students on Zoom crying because they can't come to class, or crying because they're COVID positive and they feel dirty, and they feel so. It's this emotionally what we're doing to each other that worries me. It's the messaging that if you see any hazard, report it. I worry about the long-term effects of that. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Patrick, Professor O'Neill, you're up.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I guess I want to respond to a little bit of what, how do we say your name, Jimena?
Close enough, Jimena.
Jimena. I just want to respond to the stuff I agree with first. So you mentioned something about having protocol. I think that you were referring to the safety protocol app, right? So I want to mention what I think of that in regard to how science works. So we have this so-called safety app, and we accept self-reported data about people's health. And the people that are reporting it are vested because they're students and they're faculty. Faculty are getting paid to be there. Students are paying to get to school. Then we're having them self-report safety health issues about themselves that involve self-diagnosis. And then we are using that and accepting it on good faith and letting people come to campus that report that they're fine. And the question I have about that is, why would anybody that wants to be in school necessarily have to report honest information in that case? They don't want to lose their investment, and nobody wants to lose their money. But yet we have, and that relates to the mandate too, because the school passes a mandate and then it doesn't enforce it. And to me, that's more dangerous than not having a mandate at all, because what it does is it gives freedom of choice to one group of people and it takes it away from the other group. Because everybody, if we're going to talk about freedom of choice, everyone should get it. So the people that don't want to get vaccinated should get it. And then the people that do ought to know what they're getting into when they come to campus, instead of thinking that they're safe because they got a green light. That's not fair at all. So I would say, yeah, mandates are fine, I guess, if they are applied to everyone and they are enforced and verifiable, just like science that uses data that's honestly the worst kind of data that you can have for a health issue is self-reported diagnostic data. And we're going to use that to keep everyone safe. Please, that isn't what that's doing. That is making it possible to convince people to come and put themselves at risk to make money, you know, because we have to open up the buildings and have parking fees and all that. So sorry to get irate or anything, but man, if it was scientific, it would probably work. But self-reported data, really? Are we going to trust everyone that we've never met? That's not really good science, in my opinion. It's not health and safety either. It's something else. I won't speculate on what it is anymore because I don't know. It doesn't make sense. Then when you were talking about, let's see, scientists. Oh, so in regard to how science works, and I thought science was supposed to be that the guy or the woman or the man doing the experiment went into the experiment with no particular conclusion, but you might have an idea or something, but you don't set out to try to prove that what you think is right. You set out to find out what is right. You might test a hypothesis that you think might be right, but I mean, if we go into things already with a conclusion, how is that not going to be subject to lots of bias and ambition and stuff? So I have a problem with, that's one of the things about academia that bothers me, is that people talk about science, or they say that they use it to do things like help the community. But then when you really inspect it, along with some of these publications that we all read, if you really look at it, they don't talk about their limitations a lot of the time of their studies, and they have selective data, and it's bad form, really, because we're not supposed to do that if we want to be scientists, I think. Now, I didn't mean anything personal about that to you, Human. I didn't mean anything like that. I just mean, in general, it's been very disappointing to see that some of the stuff that's in the media and that our school administration uses to regulate, the mandate and to keep us safe is based on science that really isn't science, or it's not good science, in my opinion. So I agree with you there too. If we're going to have a protocol, let's try to have one that works. And also honesty is important, so that if you don't lie to anybody, you tell them what they're getting into, and then they get to make a choice. If they don't want to go, then I guess that would give you the chance to have them not work there anymore if you wanted to, but at least they would know what they're getting into before they did it. And you wouldn't be playing favorites. Everybody would get the information and get to make their choice. That's just how I see it. I don't have a problem with people that don't want to get vaccinated. That's okay. I just don't think that, they should have anything other than accommodations. And people that do want to get vaccinated should get told if they're going to be around people who aren't. Whether or not the science indicates one way or the other, if it's dangerous or you're more likely to contract it, that's not my point, because there's two sides to that story, and both use good data and both use bad data. And we don't know for sure. But what I do know is that it's got to be, in the way that we've been dealing with it, one side gets to choose and the other doesn't, one way or the other. And that's not the way it should be. If we're going to really want to keep people safe, let's try to do that. Otherwise, let's be honest and say we're not doing that, and just let it be what it is, because then everybody knows what they're doing. That's it for me. That's all I've got.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Sorry.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, I hadn't thought actually about your argument about everyone should have liberty of choice. It's a clever, it's a very interesting argument that I think has a lot of merit. I hadn't thought of that way, so I appreciate it. Professor Flint.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity to come to talk and to kind of voice concerns that I have. I've been teaching up here at BC in person really after the spring semester, where we shut down for about 6 weeks, and I started teaching again in person in the fall. So teaching automotive, it's pretty hard to try to teach a hands-on craft in an online environment. And so I have a lot of grace for how the district really has handled this stuff at the beginning of the pandemic, when we didn't have the luxury of knowing what we know now. In the beginning, we were told that the death rate may be as high as 10 and 20%. And back then, decisions were being made out of fear of the unknown, and then the best scientific guess. But that's really not the situation that we're in today. Now that we have 2 years of real data to make decisions from, I don't understand how we can continue down the path that we're on as a district. It's like we have eyes that don't see and ears that don't hear. So we now have compelling evidence that natural immunity is superior to that of vaccination. And the vaccinated and the unvaccinated alike can contract and spread and die from the virus. I've had many vaccinated students contact me that have had to quarantine because they're sick and they tested positive. The vaccine's proven to fail at preventing the spread of COVID, and yet it's still required by the district policy, while natural immunity is being ignored like it doesn't exist. And I don't think that's very scientific. So we're required to wear a mask, but the masks that people are wearing are ineffective at filtering an aerosolized viral particle. And certainly touching your face and mask with dirty hands constantly and contaminating your mask should be considered much more unhealthy for the individual than not wearing a mask at all. So to me, that's common sense. In light of all of the data and the information that we know now, it surprises me and it frustrates me that the district continues to hang on to these policies and has doubled down on their enforcement by hiring private security to run off the students that don't comply. Throughout the pandemic, I've always been on the side of liberty, to let people choose for themselves how they want to deal with this. People should be afforded the freedom to make their own risk assessment. So vaccine hesitancy is real. It's not unreasonable. And there are risks from contracting COVID, and there are risks from the new vaccine. And those risks are not the same for all age groups even. I believe it's unjust for the district and the administration to force their preference of being vaccinated on all of the students, faculty, and staff. And we're seeing that reality play out in the courts right now as mandates like this are being overturned. The district policy does not promote the liberty that our great country was founded upon, and the majority of the policies are completely discriminatory based on the 14th Amendment and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So the 14th Amendment to the Constitution affords us equal treatment under the law. And it's common knowledge that anyone can contract COVID regardless of their vaccination status. And yet the district policy still requires the unequal treatment of weekly testing only those that have exemptions. So why is that? And how is that following the science? Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination against anyone based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. So in light of the Civil Rights Act, it would also seem inconsistent to me that religious exemptions are scrutinized while other personal beliefs like gender declarations on this campus are required to be accepted without question. Personal beliefs should be respected. So it's been my experience with my own students that firmly held religious beliefs are consistently questioned and challenged. The majority of the students that I'm aware of that tried to obtain religious exemptions to the vaccine have had to persistently fight to obtain a religious exemption. And many gave up or either quit coming to school altogether and went and got vaccinated so that they could register for classes. One of my students quit coming to school altogether and went back to work in the fields because he didn't want to get vaccinated and he's not religious. So there was no option for him. And that honestly breaks my heart, and I think it's unacceptable. And on top of that, it's unconstitutional to put somebody in that situation. And so KCCD I believe, is going to find itself on the wrong side of history for how they've dealt with people during the pandemic. So we certainly are marginalizing some of our students and potential students in our community based on the policy that's been set forth and enforced by private security. And every day I come to campus, I'm now burdened with the frustration that the college that I work for is wronging our students and the community with its policy. So we're recommitting the sins of the past by segregating our students in our community, not based on white or black this time, but based on vaccinated or unvaccinated. So we're supposed to be a community college that serves the needs of the community that we live in. so that the members of this community can come here and get an education, some training, certification, and better their lives. But the district policy doesn't reflect the community that we serve. Currently, the vaccination rate in Kern County is around 51%, and yet BC pushes 100% vaccination to come to the college. So the divide between the community at 51% and the policy goal of 100% vaccination by the district should not be ignored. Surely this divide accounts for the fact that the enrollment numbers are lower today than they were during the height of the pandemic. The policy is what changed between then and now. So how can we pretend that the low enrollment numbers that we see today are due to some other cause? Isn't it the change in policy more logical to cause that sort of effect in enrollments? To me, this is really a tragedy, which is causing some of our potential students in our community to delay their education in hopes that the policy will change. But that delay comes at a cost for them. There's only so many working years that you have in your lifetime. So if they delay their education a year, now 2 years, 3 years, if we continue with this policy, then ask yourself how much better off the student would have been if they had been afforded the opportunity to come to school and better themselves by getting an education. To close, I think it's really short-sighted to push for policies that you happen to agree with today while simultaneously undermining your own freedoms and liberties in the future. So politics never stay the same and leaders come and go. So if we keep going with policies like this, then what are we going to do? What would someone do when a new leader comes along that forces policies that they disagree with? In that case, you'll have no leg to stand on. If we set a bad precedent today and don't stand up for an individual's right to choose for themselves, that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Professor Flint. That was powerful. Thank you, all of our participants. You've all been so wonderful, but we're not done. Now we're going to enter the Q&A portion where we can interact a little bit with our viewers. And I want to begin by making an open invitation to all of our participants here, all of our panelists, that feel free to go through the Q&A questions and grab any that jump out to you, because I don't want to be the gatekeeper of what questions get asked or anything like that. It's an open for anyone if you see something you want to respond to. But to get us started, I'll pick one, or if I hear silence, I'll throw in another to see if we get some discussion. One of the most recent ones I see in the Q&A that struck me as interesting was that someone asked about how several of you had commented about natural immunity is more efficient, more effective, and yet we know that something like 90% of people in the hospitals are the unvaccinated. So how do we make sense of those two seemingly conflicting pieces of information? I don't know if anyone can speak to that particular.
Yeah, I can. So one is, I would like to, where does the 90% number coming from? So that's one thing. But let's say that I trust that 90% number. Okay, the data that I showed was for people that had natural immunity. So it's possible that the people that are unvaccinated and hospitalized hadn't had COVID before, so then they're naive to the virus. So that's certainly a way to explain that data.
Any other thoughts? There's another question here in the Q&A from our Senate President, Nick Strobel. He asked, it's a little bit longer, so I'll read it. How do you distinguish from dissenters in a proper science peer review process that never has 100% agreement from dissenters who complain there's a conspiracy theory against a minority view? The fact that there is a healthy debate in the scientific community seems to indicate that there's not a conspiracy going on. So how do we make that differentiation between a dissenting view and that might be normal and some sort of conspiracy thing?
I can go to this one too, and then I'll let somebody else take it. I have something I really want to say about this one. So one thing is, we're assuming that the peer review process is working as it should. Some of us think that it's not. Okay, so if you look at what happened with Angevante Chemie, this is one of the leading international journals in chemistry, and what happened is a leading researcher in or I can't say it, OChem, which happens to be my field. His article got unpublished because he said something that offended other people, and this was an opinion piece. So the fact that in an opinion piece that's happening and I won't go into all the details because that would take forever. I'm certainly happy to do that if people want to know more about that. That to me, that showed that the peer review system is still vulnerable to pressures as to what to publish and what not to publish. The other one is, I think, Nick, you kind of typed your own answer into the question, because I think people that are complaining that is a conspiracy against their minority view, they're not attacking the argument. So that's I think that's its own answer. I think when I try to evaluate something that somebody is saying, I'm looking, are they essentially going ad hominem, or are they, give me an argument against the idea, not against something else. So I think that's the way to tell them apart. Is this a rigorous, thoughtful critique, or is it just hand waving because you want to be heard? Those are different things. Yeah, so Patrick, go for it.
I was typing it in, but that's going to take forever. So I'll just say to Nick Strobel's question, that I think the best way to discern between, reasonable scientific results that are reported in various studies versus dissenting views or whatever is we got to look at these publications ourselves, all of them. Okay, if you read a news article that says 127 articles said blah, they didn't say blah at all. And you need to look at them yourselves and see what kind of data they used, where they got it, how they got it, what kind of an experiment they used to test that data. And man, if people don't report the limitations of their studies or explain them in a way that people can understand, then that's not useful science. It's science for the sake of science, which is really kind of BS, if you ask me. It's a way to make money and get prestige. But science is supposed to contribute to people's knowledge at large. And so what's the use of a study that you don't understand and you're just going to accept on the fact that somebody said it was scientific? That is completely ridiculous. And that is why we're in this situation of struggle right now, because people are too quick to do that. Did you read all the articles you cite by yourself? It's just a question to put out there. If you did, you'd be able to discern one way or the other and be doing that with some certainty. I'm not saying I'm perfect or that I've done all that. That's why I don't really have a strong view one way or the other. But I do have that view that if you're going to have such a strong argument, you should read the stuff yourself and figure it out, make sure it's logical and make sure it's sound. That's all I got for that one. Sorry. I sound so angry. I'm not angry. I'm just frustrated with the whole thing. I don't want to be mean. I'm sorry for that way I seem on camera.
Matt, I see a question in the chat that I just wanted to address because I kind of thought about talking about it initially. Is that okay? Or
Yeah.
Yeah, it's asking about comments on therapeutics. So I didn't mention that when we were talking, but Pfizer and I think it's Merck have both come out with antiviral drugs that can be taken to combat COVID-19 as well. The idea is that they need to be taken when you're symptomatic early in the course, kind of similar to Tamiflu, which we do to treat, viral influenza. It needs to be taken before you're hospitalized, and that will hopefully also decrease morbidity and mortality from COVID-19. What I do kind of want to caution people is that I think a lot of people who are hesitant to take the vaccines, and I certainly, Jimena, you were talking about that. I myself was concerned about the vaccines as well. And then I read kind of the studies that were done by Merck and by Pfizer, and that kind of alleviated some of my fears with the numbers of people that were included in the studies. And then again, I was hesitant when they opened it up to children because I have a daughter who's has a primary IgG deficiency and is immunocompromised. So, you know, we were very concerned about her health because she doesn't develop antibodies well. And I was concerned about the health of my children and the efficacy of the studies for them. So I certainly understand vaccine hesitancy, but ultimately we decided that the risk of the vaccines was smaller than the risks of contracting COVID-19 for us. And I felt like for us, like I feel a strong commitment to the need to protect our community and to protect one another and to care for those around me by also making myself hopefully less infectious. And again, like the Omicron variant certainly has changed that a little bit because the vaccine is less able to prevent infection with Omicron compared to previous ones, but the previous variants we were able to. But that being said, what I would kind of caution people is that I see that these medications or treatments or therapeutics, people may not see the need to be vaccinated because they can just take the therapeutic instead. And I would suggest that taking a combination of antiviral drugs probably poses greater health risks to you than we think we're going to see with the vaccine at this point. Those are some pretty serious antivirals. It's kind of a combination of antiviral drugs in those therapeutics, similar to kind of what we give HIV patients to suppress HIV replication. And that while they're effective, and certainly if someone is high risk for developing complications from COVID, they're recommended, it's recommended that you take it. But I just would suggest to the general public that you don't want to kind of have that in your back pocket as an alternative to trying not to catch COVID-19 or to vaccination, because those medications are not without risk as well.
And along those lines, there's a question that just came in the chat that similarly asks, from Timothy Plett, one of our professors in STEM. For all, he says, what would you consider to be the appropriate criteria for determining whether an approach to disease should be prevention or mitigation? And where is BC at this time? I mean, which way should we be going and what are we doing? Is it
I can speak to nursing's perspective on that. Nursing's perspective is always primary prevention is best, right? Like it's always better to prevent infection if it's a possibility. And then certainly you move to kind of secondary and tertiary care for these patients, which would be, you know, providing treatment and therapeutics and mitigating complications when primary prevention is not effective.
I'll butt in after that. Oh, sorry, Justin, you
Go ahead.
You wanted to go, right?
Go ahead.
You know, to me, and I think at this stage, even Fauci has come out and said, look, everybody's going to get Omicron. So transmissibility is, to me, is a key factor. And, you know, Omicron is so highly transmissible that I don't think that prevention is like any real, like having trouble putting my thoughts into words. But so one of the things that I've seen is there's this push towards zero COVID. We're still having, I feel like the policies are still, we're stuck back in March 2020 where we wanted to go down to zero COVID. That I think is going to be impossible. So I don't think right now that the focus should be on zero COVID. It should be on how do we protect the vulnerable and open the rest of society. Because the other thing, there's a couple other points that I really wanted to make. One is, you know, it is a medical impossibility to live in a disease-free world. And yet that seems to be the idea that's been developed with COVID that the public has, that we're somehow going to beat this virus. It's like, we're not going to beat this virus. This is going to become endemic, as happened with the Spanish influenza pandemic. Okay, so that's one. Two, and I think this is seen at like airports and other places. It's like pre-COVID. Since when is it anybody's responsibility, like a college or an airport or a supermarket or a coffee shop, Since when is it their responsibility to guarantee that you're not going to get COVID? Because I mean, it seems to me that these policies are geared to doing just that. So, and then, I mean, there are things that I have to be honest, like, I still don't know what to do with the fact that there are chains on our campus. There are chains on our campus. Okay, so the same people, which most of us agree to this, okay, we all agree that everybody should have equal opportunity to education. But there are chains on our campus. Like, I know, Tim, that's not what you asked, but it kind of, like, that's where I go with that. So, like, in the interest of keeping everybody safe, which some of us question whether these measures really keep everybody safe, look at all the things that we have now accepted as normal. This has now become normal. And I'll confess to being in a meeting and asking, are there conversations happening as to when we consider this endemic? And I was screamed at for asking that question. So what some of us worry about is that, where is the end in sight? Like, when do we call this, okay, this is endemic? BC or the district is now no longer responsible, which we can argue, should they have been in the first place? Like, they could have made recommendations as to, hey, people, this is what we recommend to keep everybody safe. But enforcing it and getting more and more strict, tightening the screws more and more as we go along, those of us who've taught at BC pre-COVID, do you remember what the first 2 weeks of college were like? Do you remember, like, the students walking around, like the excitement in the air? Like, do you remember that? Did you see these last 2 weeks? Those of us who were on campus, did you all see what I saw? Because I saw people walking, like, seldom in groups, with their heads down, with their shoulders hunched. Like, am I the only one seeing that? So public health is not just about COVID. It shouldn't be just about COVID. So there. Sorry, I know I sound angry too. I feel passionately about this. Okay, and I think it's not being said, and those of us who are saying it often get labeled as, you don't care about people dying. I do care about people dying. I care a lot. You know the numbers that I've never seen, and I want to put this out there, because if anybody has seen them, please send them my way. Okay, so I did research in nicotine addiction. As of 2009, there were 40,000 yearly deaths in the U.S. from smoking related illnesses. Okay, 40,000. Right, that's just one cause. Okay, so I've never seen the numbers of what was the percentage mortality rate in the major categories pre-COVID, and what do those look like now? Because that's how we tell how many of those deaths are now getting funneled into COVID deaths, right? Because until we know that, we don't know the real risk that COVID poses. And until we know that, we can't make real, like I feel the public is being bombarded with hard numbers. 120,000 people died of COVID last year, or 200,000. And I'm, all right, that sucks. It sucks for everybody who died. How many died of car accidents? How many died of cancer? How many died of obesity? Can you give me something to put that number in context so we can make risk assessments on that? Yeah, sorry, I'm shutting up.
I think we did pretty good in the beginning in letting people choose for the most part. Like I've always been about the liberty side, freedom. Like, we already teach adults. So we teach adults up here that can choose for themselves. And I've kind of been on that side the whole time. Like let these students choose for themselves how they want to deal with it. They're responsible for themselves. I'm not necessarily responsible for them. When we have all the measures available to us now that people can protect themselves, I don't feel the obligation to tell other people what to do or how they live their life. And so that's where it goes over the line for me. When you start taking people's liberties and freedoms away, in the name of policy, we're stepping all over the things that made this country as great as it is. And so I haven't got as, sidetracked, although my background is controlling small particle size and I have opinions about that. To me, in the smog program, and effectiveness of some of these measures, and I can speak to stuff like that, but I've been much more concerned with how we're treating people in this, and with on what basis, is that justifiable given the laws and the things that we have already established in our country? And so I think we just ratcheted it up. I was shocked with some of the stuff that came out in the fall and then turning over the spring. I'm like, wow, this is when we're doing this? Like, we've operated for, a long time already. And we're so proud that we had no cases of transmission on this campus, right? And then we turn right around and like ratchet this place up and lock it all down. And I've been amazed by that reaction, given, how long we progressed what I would consider to be relatively successfully. And yet in some cases that was still turning people off, and some of the community didn't want to come. So it's my take on it.
One of the issues that all of what I've heard brought up was this idea of why mandates aren't okay or whatever, why they violate our freedom of choice. Well, in regard to schools, we've been getting vaccinated forever for different things, and they're mandated, all of them. You can get out of it if you have a religious exemption or some other kind of an exemption for your health reasons or whatever, but I don't think that the school hires people if they just say they don't want it. And you can't even be a student. I went to school and I had to have inoculations. You got to get inoculations if you leave the country. So trying to say that mandates in general is something that we don't support or believe in or do, it isn't really true, because we've done it with those and it seems to have worked pretty good. We don't have a lot of diseases that we used to running rampant through our society. Like, I don't know if this is applicable to schools, but smallpox and measles and stuff doesn't occur every day. And so maybe, I know nobody wants to go get a shot. I didn't really feel excited about it either, but I did want to be the first of my friends and family to go and do it, so that if something was going to happen, it would happen to me, and it didn't. And so I think, man, it's okay to not want to do it, and I support that, but maybe it would be okay to wait a while too, before we all rush back to campus and put other people at risk. And, if somebody's not vaccinated and the other side thinks that they're in danger, why don't you support that person by arguing that they should get accommodations? And the same with students, that you don't want to come to school. I think maybe the school should accommodate that by making online instruction available, by, not threatening anyone with dismissal, because that stuff is all bad. There's nothing good comes from that, except for it might generate some fun. And what we need to do is get together on this, because we don't need to hate each other because we have different ideas about whether you should get a vaccine. We should support both. If you know somebody that wants to be safe and get it, man, hope that they don't die and support their decision, and don't go around them if you're not vaccinated, because they think you're going to get them sick. Maybe you won't, but you might. So why not just play on the safe side? Slow it down. Wait a while, then go back. We don't know what's going to happen yet.
I'm just going to respond to that really quick, because it's kind of what we're talking about in the chat extensively and I completely understand the idea of like, kind of I'll protect mine, you protect yours, that kind of thing. That seems kind of pervasive today, and I'll make my choice and you make your choice. But I do want to say that the choices that we're making affect each other, right? Like, we never make a choice that's in a vacuum, regardless of what you feel on each, issue. Like, the choices do have an effect on others. The conversation I'm having in the chat is that, that really, if someone doesn't want to get vaccinated, then that's fine. And that it's just up to them to assume the risks associated with it, especially since and legitimately Omicron, it doesn't seem to prevent transmission very well. But I do just keep wanting to mention the impact that we're having on the healthcare system, because that does have a greater effect on others. If large numbers of people are entering the healthcare system, for emergency care at one time because they chose not to be vaccinated, that does affect the care that's available to be provided to others. So in that way, the choice of someone to become unvaccinated and to become sick or to die is going to impact other people in the sense that we won't have availability of healthcare for the other people. I know at the hospitals in town, a lot of the elective surgeries are being canceled. A lot of kind of preventative care are being canceled. People are going to kind of these Zoom office appointments and stuff like that, because there isn't an availability of providers, and there isn't the availability of space, because a lot of the space is being taken up by patients who have contracted COVID-19 and need the hospitalization and the medical care. So I'm just putting that out for you guys to think about, that, all of our decisions have consequences, and none of our decisions are made in a vacuum. And I think I would really love to see nurses particularly, and people in other professions and people around the world trying to be a little bit more considerate of others, instead of kind of this very tribalistic, like it's about me and my group and I'm going to protect mine and I'm going to make decisions for my group and you're going to make decisions for your group. We do need to have some kind of collaboration, because we're a community. We're not existing on an island.
I can respond to that. I have two. One for Patrick. One is, so I don't think it's accurate to compare things like the polio vaccine or the measles vaccine to the COVID vaccine, for two reasons. One, the safety data from those vaccines was available for 100 years before mandating those. Two, those vaccines are what are called sterilizing vaccines, meaning if you're vaccinated, you don't contract the virus and you don't transmit it. Those are not the vaccines we have for COVID. I think if we did have those, we might be having a very different conversation here, right? But I'll be honest about something. Like, I have never questioned vaccine mandates at all until now. Now I question school mandates too. I'm like, should these be mandatory, or should we instead educate the public about the risks and the benefits of those and let people choose? So that was one point. And then
can I please interrupt you? I'm sorry. Can you tell us why the COVID one is one that you don't desire, and what is wrong with it?
Okay, so we don't know what the safety risks are, okay? And I actually have a personal reason of something that I've observed in the lab that gives me pause. So I can certainly share that one. Okay, so this is something that I saw in the lab when I did research. I didn't read it in a paper. This is my own data. Okay, so that for me, that makes it very real, because I did it. No, like, it's not something I read that somebody else did. So what we would do is we would inject mRNA into cells, and the cells would make a protein and we would study it, right? So we weren't after, like, the whole mRNA vaccine, but the process is similar, okay? And what I observed was that if we injected the mRNA too often or too much of it, more cells in that petri dish would die. That increased cell mortality rate. Okay, now, to be fair, there could have been other factors, like, certainly the size of the needle is much larger with respect to the size of the cell than with a human person. So that could be it. Okay, but for me, I worry about the long-term side effects of hijacking the ribosomal mechanisms in cells on a regular basis. Okay, I think, okay, 1 shot, 2 shots is one thing. Regular boosters every 5 months, I worry about that leading to metabolic stress. Another concern is the spike protein was supposed to be anchored at the injection sites. Well, it isn't. And we know that that has cytotoxic effects. That's part of the reason why we see some of the side effects from the vaccine mimic those of long-form COVID. I also want to address a question on the chat with that, because somebody asked, why have they been linked to infertility? And the reason for that is that in some studies, it's been seen that they end up in the ovaries and in the testes. So with women, anything that affects the ovaries is always kind of a concern, because you're born with all the eggs you're ever going to have. So that's the concern. Has that been validated? No. Okay, but some of us have concern. To Alicia, I feel there's this push that it's vaccine or nothing. Okay, why is it only the vaccine, the method that we have to reduce hospitalization, right? Also, with the vaccine mandates for healthcare workers, we pushed a lot of people out. So that's another factor why we have a shortage. I'm not saying it's the only one, but I'm saying it can't be ignored. I'm not saying you're ignoring it, but there's that. And then finally, let me see. As Kendra pointed out, why hasn't hospital capacity been increased? I agree with that one. Like with cigarettes, they tax cigarettes, and those taxes go to fund research. So why haven't we taxed, say, vaccines or testing or masks, and then use that to increase hospital capacity, for example, for funds? So yeah, okay, shutting up now.
I still don't understand what the problem is with the vaccine, because it's reminding me of this argument. And I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a French scholar that came out and said that if we got vaccinated, that vaccine would cause us to have, was it antibody dependency or something like that.
Merrick's
you know what
disease.
I'm talking about?
Yeah,
What's
Merrick's disease. Merrick's disease.
So I was supposed to be dead by now, by the way. And I'm fine. I got vaccinated almost 2 years ago. I should be dead right now. I'm fine.
Wait, why?
Better than I used to.
Why should you be dead? I
Because
didn't
that's
follow.
what that guy argued. He said that we were going to get antibody dependent, man, I can never remember how to say it, but the disease that causes white blood cells to multiply rapidly and then kill your own red blood cells, which is something that happens in other diseases and other situations, but it hasn't happened to me yet. And I don't think it's very likely to happen to many people, because we've had it for almost 2 years and we're not dead or sick. Just a speculation on my part, I guess. But I mean, I was scared to get it too. I thought, oh man, maybe this weird conspiracy stuff has something to it. It doesn't. If it's the rapture, screw it. We're all screwed anyway. That's all.
Isn't it true though that this that the vaccine never went through the actual clinical trials, right? Like they usually are like a 10-year whatever to get through the official clinical trials, and then in the middle of the trials that they were trying to do, the control group went and got vaccinated, and then they were never able to complete it. And so because we're under emergency use in that regard, then the data that they normally would have gathered before they approved these vaccinations is lost to time, and now everybody that got it is in the study.
No, both of the vaccines did go through clinical trials. They were approved under the emergency use, but now they are fully authorized. We're no longer under the emergency use for either Pfizer or Moderna at this time. And people that are getting the vaccine are not in the clinical trials. I mean, they are collecting data on us, obviously, on everyone that's getting vaccinated. Like we can report through the VAERS system if we have side effects, that kind of thing. But there were actual clinical trials, completed by the pharmaceutical companies.
Maybe somebody in the chat can help me out with this one. Maybe Kendra, who's pointing out that like I think it's phase 4, like on clinical trials. I can't remember if it's phase 3 or phase 4. That stage lasts for 3 to 5 years. It hasn't been long enough for that to be completed, because we've only had the vaccines for a year. So we don't have enough long-term safety data. Whether they have been approved, that might be true, but they haven't been through the same phase 4 or phase 3. I really can't remember which one it is. So somebody in the chat can correct me. Because there hasn't been enough time for that. So that it's like, they might have changed the process to be able to slip this through. I don't know about that, but it hasn't been the same than anything else before.
I'm looking at the CDC website right now, and it's talking about clinical trials. The phase 4 is always done after the drug is approved, no matter what drug it is. So that's nothing different than the way that all medications and vaccines are treated, just a FYI.
Well, I want to ask one other question that's kind of related. We're talking about the study and trials and looking at the data. And someone in the chat had asked about our local data, that we had CTE students who were continuing during the pandemic, and they were in face-to-face when everybody else was not. And do we have data? I know several of you work in CTE, so did we have trouble? Did we do well? Did we not do well? How did it work for those students?
My students were face-to-face because the program that I teach for the state with the SMOG program, it requires face-to-face. And so when we went fully online, for 2 weeks, I had a fantastic group of students that were very bright in one of my top, it was a engine performance, computer controls. They have to go through a ton of prerequisites to get there. And in my genuine best conscientious effort, my students tanked, and they just did not grasp the information that we were trying to pass on without the opportunity to actually use their hands to do it themselves. And so, like, a lot of people that find themselves in the trades, like I would count myself that way, like my brain's in my hands, right? Like, and so coming back face-to-face in the fall was fantastic. We're in a hybrid format where they do lectures online, but then their labs are in person, face-to-face. It works out great. It was something that we were planning on doing prior to the pandemic. So, but our success rates and stuff like that is fine as far as that goes, but we're going to dig on some of that data a little bit more to make sure. But it kind of continued, and it wasn't a big deal. I had some kids that got COVID, and they were sitting in a car next to each other, and then the lab partner did not get COVID, even back then. And so it wasn't we were able to finish classes.
I can speak to nursing. We never went fully virtual, obviously, because we can't do clinic virtually. So we were fortunate that our clinical partners in the community allowed us to stay on the clinical floors, including taking care of COVID patients. So our students had those experiences. And in December, we graduated approximately 60 RN students and also another 10 BN students. So we appreciate the community supporting us and letting us be out there with our students. We did go virtual for some of our classroom experiences, but we remained in clinic. Pretty much we've consistently been in the clinical setting.
Thanks. And thank you to all of our panelists and our participants today. I think we had a good discussion. It kind of went here and there and a little everywhere, but I really appreciate the collegiality and the feeling that we could really ask anything and have a friendly discussion without attacking each other. So well done to our panelists. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. That wraps up our panel for the evening. Have a great night.